Liquid Amber are absolutely thrilled to be bringing this extremely beautiful book, we think, to you. And can I also take this moment also to thank the artist, Sharon Monagle. I think, Sharon, you are in the gallery with us tonight. Thank you again for the use of your absolutely gorgeous image for the cover, and also thanks to Dave Hughes from Liquid Amber Press for his wonderful design, which makes this book, I think, such a joy to hold and to read. Leaf is an extraordinary achievement of eco-poetic art. Anne's poems are in startling and intimate dialogue with the things that grow, challenging the very fundamentals of perception and indeed of language itself. Her delicate and innovative work embodies what it might actually mean to deconstruct the opposition between culture and nature, allowing us to hear both the voice of the human poet and the breathing, rustling world of bark and leaf, root and flower. So as editor at Liquid Amber Press, it's been an absolute delight to work with Anne on this book, and we're very pleased that we are bringing it into the world tonight. And to do the honours for that, we are very pleased to have Shari Kosher, who will launch Leaf tonight. Shari is the author of several books of poetry herself, Foxstruck and Other Collisions, which was highly commended for the New South Wales Premier's Literature Awards, and also the Non Sequitur of Snow. Shari holds a PhD from Melbourne University, where she sometimes teaches, but as so often happens with PhDs, more often than not, she persists as an independent thinker, a writer and a poet. Good on you, Shari. So over to you. Thank you to launch.
Thank you very much, Rose. I'm coming to you tonight from Dja Dja Wurrung country, and it's a pleasure and an honour to do this for Anne tonight and for all of you here. So thank you also, Peter, for reading for us. That's the first time I've heard your poems voiced live, so that brings them closer as I've been reading around Anne's work. So Leaf, as we all know, is Anne Elvey's 5th full-length poetry collection. This shimmering collection of liquid listenings curates a broad liquidity of concerns, the groundswell of which has been nurtured over a prolific double decade of feminist, scholarly, poetic and activist work, not least informed by Elvey's 7 years of dedicated service as founder and managing editor of Plumwood Mountain, an Australian journal of eco-poetry and eco-poetics. This significant journal has published countless poets to date, the British eco-critical poet Peter Larkin among them. Elvey first encountered Larkin's work in the poem Arch the Apartness, Proffering Trees 3, Pollard, while editing the first volume of the aforementioned journal. And she writes that she was struck even then by Larkin's use of imagery and the ways in which, quote, the build-up of language tends to take me toward the otherness of plants, especially trees in forests and plantations. So as Anne notes in her acknowledgements, Larkin was an early inspirator for the poetry in Leaf. Despite differences, significant differences, I'd say, in style and ethos, Elvey encounters Larkin's poetics as a productive querying of attenuated modes of attention, akin to prayer, in the service of unsettling habitual relations with trees. In writing about her intentions for Leaf, Elvey describes how she wanted, quote, to develop form and voice for a poetics open to the agency of trees and their enmeshments, where settler migrant poetries are unsettled by unknowing, where First Nations knowledges of trees are prior to and incommensurable with settler knowing, and from an unassimilable and necessary foreground to any eco-poetic writing, end quote. Elvy's strenuous activities in cultivating cultural canopies that cumulatively proffer an ongoing commitment to the unsettling of colonizing logics also proffer, in part, an answer to her own stated question in a recent essay of hers in New Directions. Can settler poets share decolonization? Leaf is a book that will surely merit scrutiny in answer to this question. Leaf is composed in 5 parts. Part 1 signals its intention in the section titled To Listen for the Leaf, which gathers together 10 poems that negotiate various leaf-human relations. Part 2 approaches the matter and manner of how we might begin to interpret tree-related losses across 5 poems whose gatherings speak the title, The Dark Industry of Life. This question of interpretation works in latent ways, as the second-person actor in the opening poem of this section, How Is It You Interpret Things, could be read from the perspective of a living tree encountering a human speaker, or a tree being beheld and questioned by its human observer, or indeed, as Elvy herself imagines it, this is a poem addressed to the wind. Either way, this poem astutely handles the transference of energy as material, whereby air and water connect across species in a dynamic motility of living relation. The poem ends with the lines, quote, against the bend and the pull of a solid, you ebb, you flow, like a liquid handling a thing. Part 3, Luring Water, continues this theme with 11 poems that depict various encounters with local coastal banksias and other found plants in locations which ground Elvy's home place on Boonwurrung country in the Bayside suburb of Seaford, albeit with 2 exceptions. Part 4, These Knuckles Welt on Wood, turns towards deictic and first-person rhetorical modes across 9 slow poems focused on the pandemic and climate change, with an ear to more than human worlds and agencies in a context of colonial invasion. That's a quote from Anne's notes. But these poems also allude to personal terrain in which human relationships carry the plagencies of leaf tissue also. The opening poem of this section, Regeneration, is a poignant example of this, and I'll read it here. Regeneration. A trigger. Choose a moth hole in the conversation. Streaming, I mend with slow stitch while doubt dresses in the worn knit of another's need, unpicked like my own. Outside, wild breath's havoc leaves me scathed and wondering, can I pick up the ripped limbs again, knowing I too am woven, bark thin and brittle. The final section of this leaf-oriented collection, Not to Spoil the Well, riffs across 12 poems whose, quote, mesh towards hydration, end quote, interleaves the personal with the political emplacement of non-human and more than human others, such as the limbs of fallen trees in dialogue with yellow-tailed cockatoos, or pollen-focused bees making auditory overtures in the pink quivers of the succulent expanse of a commonly named pig face, or a second-person dedication to the voice of the wind who, quote, improvises in leaves, a wing cleft, a cherish, a thriss, 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 which endures the atmosphere's unwording. In Leaf, the poetry asks, if settler poets can share decolonization, how might leaves imagine us? How might trees or even a single leaf share their speaking with us? How indeed might we meet or imagine such encounters? How equipped are we to listen? And there's a beautiful epigraph by John Ryan, who's going to read later, that says in better words than those, exactly those questions. Each section of LV's collection is prefaced with a page of hand-drawn visual poems, singular images of trembling leaves encircled by lowercase text, structured by larger case text, which labels each leaf's shape with its attendant nomenclature in flowing cursive. This device visually separates each leaf from its neighbouring leaf, with the space around the edges of each leaf populated by self-reflexive description in smaller print, such that the reader is viscerally aware of both the tactile nature of the leaves called to hand, as well as the isolating function that classification incurs. This gesture, not without its hand-drawn charm, also problematizes settler modes of knowledge, such that the reader is immediately subject both to the effort of deciphering the text that encircles each leaf, as well as being warned or reminded that sometimes we can only see what we have names and stories for. What then in taxonomical isolation do we imagine when encountering the diversity of singular leaves among a multitude of leaves in unsettling contexts? The implicit question of naming enters the poetics even before the first word, which happens to be you in the first text-only poem in the book, titled Leaf. And this conundrum, both in subject position and in multivalent address, is suitably amplified by the title of the first section, To Listen for the Leaf. That is, to listen for, not to listen to or with. This is an intentional word choice and seems to be deliberately pricking us to ask, how is this not unproblematic? Here, in one sense, we might find ourselves in the realm of John Kinsella's resistance function of poetry, as LV herself notes in her Poetry as Alternative section of her chapter Writing, Unwriting, Writing in the recent New Directions collection I mentioned earlier. That is, Aka Kinsella, quote, "The poem that asserts the beauty of a flower may be intended as its own activism for that flower against human encroachment." Peter Larkin's tree poetics might, on the surface, seem incommensurable with Peter Minter's depiction in New Directions of First Nations people's living sense of ongoing mutual obligation in relation to trees, such that the emergence of a corresponding genealogical I in Aboriginal poetics might sit uneasily with other readings of Larkin's poetics to date. And I won't say which, there's Saita and Elvi, and there's much to read about Larkin's poetics to date. And yet, Jill and Gladys Milroy in Trees Are Our Families Too suggest that latent knowledges of right relation exist in all of us, but that we need to respectfully remember which story we are in before we can act in right relation with other stories. How are such paradoxes encountered in Leaf Business, or even countered by encounter in LV's own Leaf? Resistance as a productive force catapults Leaf into questioning what is reciprocal when subjectivity is thrown open in relation to who might be fleetingly inhabiting the you in LV's poems, in all their flux and shimmer. Sometimes the you is a plant or tree addressed, either in dedication, such as in the poem To the Apple Box, but Eucalyptus bridgesiana, or in tender observation, as in the poem Coast Banksia in a Neighbour's Backyard, in which the speaker reads the signals of a tree as a kind of chosen speech. Quote, "Your bone shift of limb and bare leaf are mostly mute, even in gale, until snap, your branch or half a trunk crushes the line." end quote. In other poems, such as in the rhyme Banksia intergrifolia, there is a withdrawing of speech, as if the objectified plant objects and decides to withdraw from the hour of humans in settle escape, whose speaker declaims, quote, where the asymmetry of gums is elegant, on the whole, a Banksia bristles. It will not say, consider yourself at home. Resistance as both tactic and as connective tissue may be one mode of accessing a version of principled unknowing in Elvy's Leaf. In the opening text-based poem of the section that foregrounds the act of listening for, the brief 8-line poem Leaf proffers a heightened sense of tactility as one form of possible attunement when finding one's respectful place in story. It's a brief and minimalist poem, consisting of 2 4-line stanzas built on imbrications of formatted pause or white space. Leaf. You touch from inside's other, after which there's a pause, a barely perceptible breath in which the same line turns a sensate touch to visual cue. You touch from inside's other, vein and skin, silver to a spot of rust, smooth. At this stanza break, there's a fulcrum. Textured listening turns on leaf as hand and as leaf in hand, both. In terms of affect, Eve Sedgwick, quoting Renu Bora, observes that, quote, smoothness is both a type of texture and texture's other, liminally registered on the border of properties of touch and vision. The second stanza continues this liminal touch, which exudes the unsayable inside the breath that is shared between an implicit I and you, not fully graspable and certainly not taken for granted. What is human and what is leaf already, and who is saying you? To the swell of an insect's egg held in fingers, breath becomes a word. And that's the final poem in whole in its 2 4-line stanzas. Breath becomes a word. There is mystery here, as there needs to be, in the foregrounding of a non-linguistic tactility as nuanced as that which passes between hands, as between stories in shared exchange. For without breath, in a world denuded of leaves, there can be quite literally no word. A hand in the you who listens is also a hand who breathes, whose rhythms are prescribed by time, leaf and human both. And whatever is held in this poem, in the finger of a breath, also implicates the swell of an insect's egg, the multiple pauses of how we are invited to slow down enough to listen differently, uncertainly, and in difference, empty-handed. Maybe leaves listen like this always, maybe not. Elvy is alive to the problem of subject positioning as well as to the human-centered urge to decode leaves performing their artful scripts. For Elvy, the vegetal imaginings encountered in Larkin's poetics activates a theologically inflected listening for, whose relational imbrications proffer an unsettling glimpse of what elsewhere Elvy has named provisionally as, quote, a green night of the soul. It is from this productively troubling topoi that many of the poems in Leaf might be read. In an astonishing essay in response to Larkin's poem Praying Firs Attenuate, Elvy confesses, and I quote, and I think this quote is important for perhaps framing how we might approach reading some of the poems in Leaf. Elvy confesses, my sense personally was of divine absence. in the traditional mode of there not seeming to be a personal presence at the other end of the address, you. But my poetic attentiveness to wind, trees, creek, birds, and so on in the area where I live, and to vegetables, food preparation, bodies, the everyday world of domesticity, felt like a different kind of night, a different divine withdrawal than the divine absence which Dark Night of the Soul suggests. Here, divine missing seems more connected with the impossibility of undoing ecological damage, as well as the kinds of cruelty governments practice, and the ensuing withdrawal of divine comfort or a feeling from the sacred, except as grief. So a green night is more connected with the divine, with this divine missing, and the ground of this missing in an attentive and ethical orientation to more than human, including human others, end quote. Networks of settler poetic listings and listenings, and an orientation towards such listenings for, undoubtedly galvanise the opening section of Leaf. Among poems that foreground local connections to place and other poets, Julia Kristeva and Paul Celan are also featured, such that literary family are an explicit part of this poetry's canopy of connection. The final poem in this opening riff, What to Do in Early Autumn, responds to Paul Celan's Corona. And this poem hints at lacunae the rest of the book seeks to unentangle. The use of the imperative mode, for example, in the anaphoric ungentling of let in this poem, reminds me of what Elvie has depicted elsewhere as akin to prayer, even as it echoes Celan's intentional unsettlement from within the language of the oppressor and the oppressor's ongoing conditionals. Indeed, perhaps this poem suggests a tuning that seeks direction in the effacing and effacement of all instructions. As Peter Minter quotes Kakadu man Bill Nidji in a medicine poem that speaks to all that can't be said here, but which feels pertinent to me in relation to Elvie's sense of intersubjective and interleaved longing in Leaf, you feel because your body in that tree or earth. Nobody can tell you. You got to feel it yourself. That's from Tree in Minter in New Directions. I'm going to read the short poem, What to Do in Early Autumn, after Paul Celan, Corona by Anne Elvie. Tuck a spider in an emerald shell. Let a dry sprig cling to its stem. Its crimson gives nothing to the tree. Let the sun lick the brine from your skin. The mollusk has quit its case. Ask what answer your hands should give. It is time. It is time they listened for the leaf. And so with both and all of our hands, it is time to celebrate a multivalent act of listening by launching Anne Elvie's poetry collection, sung with the light kindling power of leaves from within or beside a green night of the soul. Please join me in declaring Leaf in all its pleasures and paradoxes alive and launched. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Shari. What an absolutely wonderful introduction. And thank you so much for your insightful and thoughtful responses to the book. So let's hand over to Anne Elvie without any more ado and hear Anne read from this wonderful book. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Rose, Peter, Shari, and all the open mic readers. Can you hear me? Okay, so I'm going to share my screen. Let me begin by acknowledging that I live and work and am reading here this evening on unceded Boon Wurrung country. I pay my respects to Boon Wurrung elders past and present, recognising their sovereignty here and ongoing connection to and care for country. As Shari mentioned, most of the poems in Leaf are situated on Boon Wurrung country. There are also poems here situated on Dja Dja Wurrung country, Briar Coulon country, Wurundjeri country, Bindal and Wu Gurukaba country, and Yorta Yorta country. I pay my respects to all the elders, as well as to any sovereign First Peoples here tonight. Thank you, Shari, for your considered and generous speech, and for the time you've given to reading my work, and especially for the conversations we've had from which I'm learning so much. It is a delight to have you launch Leaf, Shari. We first met in a poetry workshop taught by the late Judith Rodriguez in 2007. And I think Judith would be pleased to see us connecting in this launch. So I feel like she's with us in spirit. Thank you to Peter and to John in advance for reading your plant-focused work for us tonight. It's such a joy to have you here. And thank you, Rose and Pauline, for your editing and publishing skills that have made this book more than it might otherwise have been. And thank you too to Sharon Monagle for the beautiful cover image, and to David Hughes and Pauline for the wonderful book design. And these are the people I'm thanking some of their work. So please look it up. So thank you to John Ryan and to Harriet Tarlow for your generous recommendations. And here are a few publications from the people I've just mentioned. So Rose, Peter, and Shari. I don't have a single author book by John, but this is his wonderful co-edited Mind of Plants volume, and Harriet's Cut Flowers, which I'm pretty sure is from the same press as John's Seven Leaf Sermons. So, and then the book Leaf is dedicated to my partner, husband, Greg Price. Greg has been a volunteer grower for the Tree Project for between 25 and 30 years and is now also a trainer for younger growers, or mostly younger growers. So it's fitting that a book written in response or for plants is dedicated to him. And I thank him especially for his support of my writing. So because Liquid Amber Press has a sense of the visual and poetic together, I thought I'd show you a couple of the visual elements of the book. So each of the sections starts with a leaf sketch, which they've made, which I did, but they've made look rather nice with the reversing of the black and white there. And as Shari mentioned, there are some leaf names. The names of leaves, albeit important, and I loved Shari's reading of this, show something about their diversity. And I've written small poems riffing off their names and stories in all sorts of ways. So I'll just read the first three. Acicular, needled needling, a spill onto ground there's need. Cordate, a tether shaped to a heart's bulging persistence. Elliptical, solid to hand to ground, the way of a planetary year. Okay, and in this poem, leaves are interrupting language. So a poem punctuated for Anne M. Carson. And hi, Anne. I saw your note in the chat before. Hi, a poem punctuated. Who lives the unsayable between leaves pressed into card? A thumb's print, a keeping, foliate aptitudes divulge a past, when exhalations change. Breathed air revisits in the breathing animal, and so breathes a word between leaf time and lung, hand and mind. Palm into fingers, tenderly lift towards stem to call forth voice. Sonorous attention does not allied harm what stifles, catching in the throat may sprout. And this is the last visual I'll show. Waterborne was part of a commission by Red Room Poetry for poets shortlisted in their fellowship last year. And it considers the colonial naming of Banksias, which form a central focus of the book, and their resistance to that naming on country, with a focus on relations to water. So waterborne, so the colonist, the colonial botanist, who I leave unnamed, is waterborne, but the trees have other relations to water. An empire disembarks with a botanist. You thrive in coastal scrub with tea tree blossoming. Water brings a name. He'll be a night. Insufficient to your wind-bent adventuring. Water answers your fine-rooted valor, your rough armor, your open-handed pods, their sprung cups. So now I'll just read a few, 2 or 3 poems directly from the book. I'm not sure that I've completely picked leaf poems or tree poems, but I'm going to read one, Sun Glint Drift, which references the local creek, Cananook Creek on Boonwurrung country. And this appeared earlier in Writing Water, which was also a Red Room project edited by Eunice Andrada. Sun Glint Drift, a name for what speaks this day to water. As creek replies, mirror. A woman is not the scene. This is private talk, though she witnesses a multitude of small sparkles unshifting on flow. A possibility of cooperation in reflection, where currents are both repeated and new. The woman disappears into its age, a visitor who might be, but is not quite, estranged. Without certainty, she imagines the elders who came by light water for tucker or song, those who keep it now in care according to law. It is not hers, this place. Receiver of stolen goods, the woman retreats. Creek gives to land a liquid testimony. And I hope Andrew's still here. I thought I'd read this. Andrew, my son Andrew is in France, but he was in Melbourne at the end of last year, beginning of this year, after 2 years. Yep, still here, he says. Okay, so this is toward the turn of the year. On the calendar my ancestors used in a place not theirs. I was walking on a track with my son. Another mammal emerged on all fours from scrub. The word might be galumphing towards us, 20 meters away. The son was visiting from France, the second year of pandemic. As the being resolved, he filmed a clip for his Gallic friends. It was mid-afternoon, warm and dry. 5 or so meters short of us, I thought of its claws and nocturnal habit. We moved to make space. The marsupial veered from the track into shade. The park where we strolled was habitat, nurtured on the site of a former military camp. A photo my son took shows the koala barely visible, camouflaged by dappled shadow and light just off the path. The trail was gravelled with skim and scatter of histories, prisoners of war and a hospital for our troops, a long century on, breathed in reservoir and stone, where Boon Wurrung country sustains. A southern emu wren flitted across our way, sun cast at our feet, its swift silhouette. Rose, is there room for one more?
How could I say no, Anne? Please
Okay.
do.
So I just thought I'd read one that Shari mentioned that initially was written as part of a response to the notion of wind companioned work, but I like Shari's wider readings of it too. So this is, how is it you interpret things? You work with density and form, speak tassel, shift still. You curtain light, dapple drift, make gentle other move and hold back motion. You press persistent to snap, tangle, to display how fragile a thing, to unsettle wisp, unhinge a limb. You advance, you wait, seen in your reading of mass and ply. Against the bend and the pull of a solid, you ebb, you flow, like a liquid handling a thing. So thank you. And thank you so much, Shari.
Thank you so much, Anne. Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Shari, for launching. That was absolutely wonderful. And I must admit, I didn't know you were going to read that poem tonight, Anne, but I think it's one of my favourites in the collection, if we can, not that I really want to hierarchize them, but that is a pretty powerful poem.